The battles in World War II were disastrous, but behind the front lines, another war was raging across Asia, where thousands of young girls were taken from their homes and forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army. They were called comfort women, but there was no comfort, only abuse, control, and silence. What started as a system to manage soldiers became one of the largest organized networks of exploitation in modern history. And for decades, their stories were buried. The story begins in 1931, when Japan launched a full invasion of Manchuria, taking control of key cities like Mukden and Chongqing. This marked the start of Japan's aggressive expansion into mainland Asia. As the Japanese Imperial Army established its presence in northern China, thousands of troops were stationed in the occupied territories. The military needed to maintain order among its own men, while also avoiding international criticism for misconduct. Within months of the occupation, foreign reporters and missionaries began sending back reports of widespread rape, violence, and forced prostitution committed by Japanese soldiers against local women. These incidents drew global attention, damaging Japan's international reputation, especially after joining the League of Nations. But instead of punishing the soldiers or reforming behavior, Japanese military authorities chose a different route. They introduced the idea of controlled sexual access to prevent random assaults. In early 1932, Japan set up the first known comfort station in Shanghai, shortly after their military clash in the city during the January 28th incident. The station was located near the front line and operated under military oversight. It was created specifically to serve Japanese troops and reduce violence against Chinese civilians. This marked the beginning of an organized, state-supported system. Japanese officers appointed medical personnel and guards to run the stations. By mid-1937, Japan had fully committed to war against China, beginning with the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing on July 7, 1937. From there, the Japanese army advanced rapidly into northern and central China. As cities fell like Tianjin, Beijing, and later Shanghai, the military's need for tighter control over its troops became urgent. The turning point came in December 1937 with the fall of Nanking. Over 6 weeks, Japanese troops carried out one of the worst mass killings and sexual assaults in modern history. Civilian men were shot or beheaded, while women were raped in the thousands, sometimes publicly, sometimes in front of family members. Reports of the Nanking massacre reached Tokyo and the international press. Japanese commanders, though silent in public, internally acknowledged that unchecked behavior by soldiers was becoming a liability. As a result, the military began rapidly expanding the comfort station system, not out of concern for the victims, but to control their own forces and avoid future scandals. From late 1937 onward, military officials gave local units the authority to create comfort stations wherever troops were stationed for extended periods. This led to the spread of stations in major cities like Wuhan, Guangzhou, and eventually inland areas such as Changsha and Chongqing. As Japanese armies moved into new provinces, stations were established behind the front lines, often in abandoned schools or civilian buildings. By 1940, the number of these stations had grown into the hundreds, with some estimates suggesting over 400 active locations spread across Chinese territories alone. Each station required a constant rotation of women due to disease, suicide, or injuries. New recruits were regularly brought in to replace those who had died or become too ill to continue. In 1941, just before Japan's entry into the wider Pacific War, comfort stations had already been set up in Vietnam, then French Indochina, Malaysia, and Singapore. These locations would later serve as hubs for moving women into Southeast Asia as the conflict expanded further. Most of the comfort women came from Korea, which had been a colony of Japan since 1910. By the 1930s, Korean society was heavily controlled by the Japanese government, and poverty was widespread. Young girls, Some as young as 12 or 13 were especially vulnerable. Recruiters often came to villages offering good-paying jobs in hospitals, textile factories, or military kitchens. Parents, desperate for income, sometimes allowed their daughters to go, believing they'd be working safely under Japanese supervision. In other cases, girls were taken without any explanation or consent, disappearing from markets, roads, or even their own homes. Once these girls arrived at their assigned locations, they were stripped of their identities. Japanese officials would often give them new names, sometimes in Japanese, to erase their background. They were registered in military records not as people, but as comfort providers with assigned numbers. Some were taken directly to military brothels built near the front lines. Others were shipped by boat or train across territories, sometimes for days without food or proper sanitation. While the majority of comfort women were Korean, many others were taken from across Asia. In China particularly, in the regions of Hebei, Shandong, and Hunan, women were seized during military raids. Entire villages were sometimes emptied of young women during Japanese sweeps. These women were held in local comfort stations or sent further inland as the army advanced. In Southeast Asia, especially in the Philippines and Indonesia, the pattern was similar. The Philippines saw the abduction of young girls in both rural provinces and urban centers. Places like Manila, Pampanga, and Leyte had documented cases of girls as young as 14 being taken from school or church. In Indonesia, then known as the Dutch East Indies, Indonesian women from Java and Sumatra were commonly targeted. Japanese authorities also detained young Dutch girls and mixed-race women from colonial families after occupying Dutch-controlled areas starting in 1942. Some were taken from internment camps where European civilians were being held and brought to serve officers in secluded compounds. Women were also taken from Burma and Thailand, especially as Japan's control expanded further south during the war. In each region, the Japanese army relied on a combination of military orders and local collaborators to find, transport, and manage women. The goal was to have comfort women available in every strategic location where soldiers were stationed or passing through. Most of these women came from poor backgrounds. Some had lost parents or guardians during previous invasions or bombings. Others belonged to large, struggling families who couldn't protect them or fight back against armed soldiers. Once captured or recruited, escape was nearly impossible. Travel was heavily restricted, borders were guarded, and women had no money, no documents, or outside contact. The women were constantly moved, depending on troop movements. If the army was reassigned, the women were forced to relocate with them. Some were transported across multiple countries over the years. Their records were rarely kept intact, and many were never seen again once they were moved. Life in these stations was a nightmare. Each woman was kept under constant watch. The rooms were small, often just wooden partitions or makeshift walls offering no privacy. Some stations were operated from abandoned schools or warehouses. Others were set up in huts, bunkers, or tents, depending on the region. There was no freedom of movement. Armed guards controlled when the women could eat, when the women could sleep, or even use the toilet. Even speaking to others could be punished if heard by a guard. Each woman had a daily schedule, which began early in the morning and continued into the night. Soldiers lined up outside their assigned rooms. The women were forced to service dozens of men each day, sometimes one after another with only minutes in between. Reports from military documents and survivor testimonies confirm that some women were made to serve 20 to 40 men per day, especially during battle seasons where soldiers were given rest time after combat. The women had no right to refuse, no safe word, and no protection. There were no breaks for menstruation, illness, or injury. Some women were barely able to walk due to infections or internal injuries, but they were still forced to keep going. Painkillers or medicine were rarely given. Instead, if a woman became too weak, she was either replaced or discarded. Weekly medical examinations were mandatory. but not for the women's well-being. These checks were done by military doctors to ensure soldiers didn't catch diseases. Women were tested for syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections. And those who tested positive were often isolated in small rooms or sent to remote facilities. Some were treated with painful injections, or even burned with chemicals. And if they didn't recover fast enough, they were either sterilized or quietly killed. Pregnancies were not tolerated. If a woman became pregnant, she was either forced to abort the baby through crude procedures or was beaten until the pregnancy ended. In cases where the child was born, the baby was sometimes taken away and killed immediately. No birth records were kept. No graves were marked. The constant violence created a sense of hopelessness. Some women attempted to run away, but few succeeded. Captured escapees were punished in front of others, beaten, starved, or locked in boxes for days. The punishments served as a warning. Some women, unable to bear the abuse, took their own lives. Others simply vanished. In many cases, their deaths were not recorded. Their bodies were buried in mass graves or burned in secret. While many stations functioned as brothels under military command, others were used for even darker purposes. In occupied parts of China, especially Manchuria, certain comfort women were not just exploited sexually, they were used for inhumane experiments. Unit 731, located in Harbin, was the center of Japan's biological warfare research. It was commanded by General Shiro Ishii and operated under the cover of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Women taken there, including comfort women, were exposed to deadly diseases like cholera, typhus, syphilis, and plague. Some were injected with bacteria to observe how their bodies reacted. Others were forced into sexual intercourse with infected men, so doctors could monitor the spread of disease in real time. Surgical experiments were also carried out. In many cases, organs were removed from living subjects without anesthesia. Pregnant women were operated on to study fetal development under infected conditions. These procedures were conducted without consent, and victims were usually killed afterward to destroy any evidence. No names were recorded. Elsewhere in Asia, comfort women faced different but equally brutal forms of abuse. In the Philippines and Burma, the shifting battlefronts meant the Japanese Army was constantly on the move. Women in mobile comfort units were treated like luggage, loaded onto trucks, moved through mountain passes or jungles, and dropped near temporary military outposts. Sometimes they were forced to walk long distances, barefoot and without food. These women had no idea where they were being taken. Their conditions worsened as supply chains collapsed and battles intensified. They slept in crowded tents or abandoned buildings with no sanitation, often exposed to rain, disease, and bombings. Soldiers became more aggressive when losing battles, and women suffered more beatings and assaults in times of defeat. To maintain secrecy, some units were ordered to eliminate comfort women before retreating. In 1943, during the Japanese withdrawal from parts of Burma, several accounts describe women being shot and buried in unmarked graves by military police. In the Solomon Islands, survivors later testified that women were tied up and drowned to erase evidence. By 1942, the comfort station system had reached its peak in size and demand. Japan's military was engaged across a vast area, from Manchuria to the South Pacific. Comfort stations were built not only in cities, but also in isolated camps near the front lines, in Papua New Guinea, the Andaman Islands, and on tiny Pacific atolls. These remote outposts were often overcrowded and undersupplied. Some women went days without food or clean water. Commanders insisted on having women close to the battlefield to keep morale high. Women were transported by sea or in military trucks under guard. Some died during these journeys due to dehydration, infection, or injuries sustained earlier. Their bodies were often thrown into rivers or buried hastily with no record. By mid-1944, Japan was steadily losing ground in the Pacific. The Allied forces, led by the United States, launched major operations to retake islands one by one: Guam, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and others. Japanese troops were under constant attack, and supply lines were breaking down. Each retreat, order collapsed, and so did the military's control over the comfort station system. As military bases fell, comfort stations were often the first sites to be destroyed. Japanese officers feared that if the women were captured, they might speak to Allied forces and reveal how the system worked. To prevent this, many commanders gave direct orders to execute the women before abandoning the sites. Some were shot, others were forced into caves or buildings, which were then set on fire or sealed with grenades. These actions, of course, were never officially recorded, but later discovered during post-war investigations. On the island of Saipan, in July 1944, as American forces approached, Japanese soldiers executed comfort women held near the front. Local reports and Allied accounts describe hearing gunfire from enclosed compounds shortly before the Japanese retreat. The same pattern was seen in Okinawa in 1945. Several Korean women were found buried near army tunnels. Some still had restraints on their wrists and ankles. In some cases, the women were simply left behind, with no food, water, or medical care, and many died before Allied troops arrived. On the island of Leyte in the Philippines in October 1944, U.S. soldiers discovered a locked structure near a former Japanese camp. Inside, they found several women, Korean and Filipino, malnourished and barely alive. They had been trapped for weeks without any communication from the outside. In Indonesia, especially on islands like Java and Sumatra, Japanese forces abandoned comfort stations in remote plantations and jungle camps. Women who had been brought from different regions were left without shelter or transportation. Some tried to find local villages. Others died from starvation or disease in the forest. By early 1945, Japan's defeat was inevitable. As the Allied forces reached Tokyo's doorstep, the military issued orders to destroy documents, eliminate witnesses, and erase any trace of the comfort system. Station logs, medical records, and transport lists were burned in furnaces or buried. In many areas, local commanders acted on their own, using mass executions to prevent any survivors from being questioned. On August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrendered after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's invasion of Manchuria. With that surrender, the comfort station system collapsed entirely. But its destruction was not a liberation for most of the women. Few of them had homes to return to, and even fewer had the means or strength to travel. The war had already taken everything from them. Many had no documents, no money, no way of proving who they were. In many cases, they returned alone, often sick or physically broken. Some made it back through the help of local villagers or Allied soldiers, while others were taken to temporary refugee camps before being sent home. For women in places like Korea, China, and the Philippines, the journey back could take weeks or even months. Once they arrived, the reception was cold and often cruel. In Korea, which had just been liberated from Japanese rule, many of the returning women were viewed with shame. Society, shaped by traditional values, saw them not as victims, but as women who had been defiled. Some families refused to accept them back. Others forced them to remain silent to avoid public disgrace. The trauma they had lived through was never asked about, let alone understood. In China and the Philippines, the reaction was similar. Most women kept quiet, afraid of being labeled or blamed. Without support systems, they tried to rebuild their lives in isolation. Some entered marriages, but never told their husbands the truth. Others lived alone, working low-paying jobs, avoiding questions about their past. Few received medical treatment, even though many were still suffering from injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, or internal trauma from repeated abuse. In Japan, The government quickly moved to erase any evidence of the comfort system. Before the Allied occupation began, military commanders ordered the destruction of official records. Paperwork detailing the transport, treatment, and deaths of comfort women was burned or buried. The new post-war government focused on rebuilding, avoiding the topic entirely. There were no investigations, no memorials, and no support programs. Survivors living in Japan, including Korean or Taiwanese women who had remained, were ignored or told to keep quiet. Only in a few cases did foreign authorities recognize the abuse. In 1948, during post-war trials held in the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch government officially documented the forced use of over 35 Dutch women by Japanese troops in Indonesia. The testimony they gave became one of the earliest forms of legal acknowledgement that the comfort woman system existed and was abusive. Despite this, most other survivors were left in silence. There were no reparations. There was no apology. For decades, comfort women lived in the shadows of post-war recovery. The psychological effects lasted for years. Many suffered from chronic nightmares, depression, and severe anxiety. Some never married because of internal damage, or the belief that no one would accept them. Others had lasting physical injuries that were never treated. A few took their own lives in later years, unable to cope with what had happened and how society refused to acknowledge it. But by the early 1990s, survivors, especially in South Korea, began finding strength in each other. In 1991, Kim Hak-sun, a Korean woman who had been taken as a teenager and forced into a comfort station, decided to speak publicly at a press conference. She became the first survivor to reveal her real name and describe her experience in front of national media. Her decision sparked a movement. In the months that followed, dozens of women came forward in Korea. Then came survivors from the Philippines, China, Indonesia, Taiwan, and even Dutch women who had been held in Japanese-run stations in Indonesia during the occupation. Each story added more evidence to what had been long denied. The testimonies came with painful detail: names of camps, timelines, the names of officers, and the methods used to transport and abuse them. In 1992, Japan's government came under pressure to respond. Investigations were launched, and wartime records were re-examined. The following year, in 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono issued what became known as the Kono Statement. He publicly acknowledged that the Japanese military had played a direct role in establishing and managing the comfort stations, and in recruiting women, sometimes forcibly. However, despite this statement, Japan still avoided any legal responsibility. There were no formal trials, no changes to school textbooks, and no official reparations. Many politicians claimed the women had been recruited by civilians or had volunteered, downplaying the military's involvement. In 1995, the Japanese government helped launch the Asian Women's Fund. It was designed to offer financial support and health services to surviving comfort women. But the money came from private donations, not the government budget. Survivors were expected to accept these payments, about 2 million yen, roughly $20,000 at the time, in exchange for a letter of apology. Many survivors rejected the fund. They argued the money wasn't enough, and that it wasn't coming from the Japanese state itself. What they wanted was an official apology backed by law, acknowledgement of criminal responsibility, formal compensation by the government, not from a charity or private group. Lawsuits began to appear in Japanese courts during this time. Survivors filed civil claims demanding reparations and apologies. Most of these lawsuits were dismissed, with courts ruling that too much time had passed, or that individuals couldn't sue the government for wartime acts under Japanese law. Even so, the legal actions drew international attention. Activist groups and human rights organizations began pushing for the issue to be taken up by international bodies. Survivors testified at hearings in the United Nations and submitted evidence to the International Commission of Jurists. By the end of the 1990s, the comfort women issue had become a global human rights concern, not just a regional problem between Japan and its former colonies. Between 2000 and 2010, a wave of legal action was taken by surviving comfort women and human rights groups. Lawsuits were filed in Japan by Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, and Filipino survivors. These cases demanded official apologies, state-level reparations, and the correction of school textbooks that had ignored or distorted the history of the comfort women system. The Japanese courts, however, repeatedly dismissed these lawsuits. As a result, many turned to the international community. Survivors testified before the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and submitted petitions to other global bodies, including Amnesty International and the International Labor Organization. In 2001, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Radhika Kumaraswamy, issued a report classifying the comfort women system as a crime against humanity and recommended that Japan take full responsibility. The issue also gained traction in Western governments. In 2007, the U.S. House of Representatives passed House Resolution 121, which called on Japan to formally and unambiguously apologize for the comfort women system. This was followed by similar resolutions in Canada, the Netherlands, and the European Parliament. These official declarations increased diplomatic pressure on Tokyo to address the issue more directly. During this time, South Korea became the central voice for the survivors. Weekly protests began in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, known as the Wednesday demonstrations. These peaceful protests began in 1992, but gained even more attention in the 2000s as international media began covering them. Survivors, often in their 80s or 90s, stood with signs and told their stories to growing crowds. In 2011, a bronze statue of a young girl was installed across from the Japanese embassy in Seoul. The statue symbolized the comfort women and quickly became a national symbol of resistance. It caused diplomatic tension, with Japan repeatedly demanding its removal, calling it political provocation. Despite years of pressure, it wasn't until December 2015 that Japan and South Korea reached a diplomatic agreement. Under the terms, Japan would provide 1 billion yen, about $8.3 million, to fund medical and social support for the remaining survivors in South Korea. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe also expressed most sincere apologies and remorse. However, many survivors rejected the agreement. They said they were not consulted during the negotiations, and the deal did not include official legal responsibility from Japan. There were also concerns that the agreement was designed to permanently silence the issue, rather than address justice. In the years that followed, new statues were installed in cities like San Francisco and Berlin, further spreading awareness. Japan responded with formal complaints, and even withdrew its ambassador from South Korea temporarily, in protest of the monuments. As of 2024, a few comfort women are still alive, but Japanese leaders and citizens continue to deny the full history. Others argue that too much focus on the issue has hurt Japan's image, but for the women who lived through it, the pain never really went away.